I found out what actually happens to employees who work the night shift at my hospital. The first time I saw someone wheeled past the nurse's station at 3:18 a.m. wearing scrubs instead of a hospital gown, I assumed they were just moving a body to the morgue using whatever was convenient. It wasn't until I recognized the sneakers, those distinctive neon green running shoes that my coworker David always wore, that my stomach dropped. I'd seen David leave his shift 6 hours earlier, waving goodbye as he headed to his car in the employee parking lot. There was no reason for him to be back in the hospital, unconscious on a gurney, being wheeled toward the surgical wing by two orderlies I'd never seen before. I'd been working as a registered nurse at Mercy General Hospital for 3 years when I took the night shift position. The pay differential was too good to pass up, an extra $8 per hour for working the graveyard shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The hospital administrator, Dr. Patricia Whitmore, had personally called me into her office to offer me the position, saying they specifically wanted experienced nurses who could handle the unique challenges of overnight patient care. She'd made it sound like a promotion, an opportunity to take on more responsibility in a quieter, more controlled environment. What she didn't mention was that night shift employees had a disturbing tendency to disappear. The nursing staff on night shift was smaller than during the day, just 5 of us covering the entire third-floor medical surgical unit. There was David, the guy with the green shoes who'd been there for 2 years. Leslie, a sharp-tongued older nurse who'd worked nights for over a decade. Amit, a quiet but competent recent graduate. And Gabriella, who'd transferred from the emergency department 6 months ago. We were a tight crew, the kind of team that develops when you're the only people awake in a building full of sleeping patients, where every sound echoes differently, and the fluorescent lights hum with a frequency that feels almost alive. David had seemed perfectly normal during our shift that Wednesday evening. We'd handled the usual routine, medication rounds, checking vitals, responding to call buttons, documenting everything in the electronic health records. He'd even joked about his weekend plans to run a 10K race, showing me the training app on his phone that tracked his miles. When his shift ended at 7 p.m., he'd clocked out through the time management system like always, and I'd watched him walk toward the employee exit. 12 hours later, I was staring at his unconscious body being transported through a hallway that was supposed to be restricted after midnight. I stepped out from behind the nurse's station and called out to the orderlies, asking what was happening and why a staff member was being moved at this hour. They didn't stop or even acknowledge me. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a completely expressionless face, swiped a keycard at the surgical wing entrance, and they disappeared behind the double doors that led to the operating rooms. I tried to follow, but my badge wouldn't open that door. My access level had never included the surgical wing, which made sense during normal operations, but the fact that orderlies I'd never seen before had clearance to areas I didn't set off alarm bells in my head. I immediately pulled up the staff directory on the computer system to see if I could identify the orderlies, but neither of them appeared in the hospital's employee database. I searched by department, by hire date, by every filter available, and came up empty. These people were moving a staff member through our hospital in the middle of the night using keycards that gave them access to restricted areas, but they didn't officially exist in our personnel system. I felt my hands starting to shake as I realized something was deeply wrong with this situation. The next morning, I tried to call David before heading home. His phone went straight to voicemail. I sent him a text message asking if he was okay and got no response. When I came back from my shift that evening, I asked Leslie if she'd heard from David. She gave me a strange look and said David had called in sick for the week, something about a bad flu. But that didn't make sense. Why would David be wheeled through the hospital unconscious if he'd simply called in sick? Why would the hospital be transporting their own employee to surgery without any record of admission or treatment? I decided to check the surgical schedule for that night, accessing the system through my nursing credentials. There was no record of any procedures scheduled between midnight and 6 a.m., which was normal. The operating rooms were typically dark overnight, unless there was an emergency. But I'd seen David being taken to that wing with my own eyes. Someone had performed an unauthorized procedure or was using the surgical facilities for something that wasn't being documented in the official hospital records. The implications of that possibility made my mouth go dry. Over the next week, I started paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. The night shift had always had a higher turnover rate than day shift, but I'd attributed that to the difficult hours and the toll that overnight work takes on people's health and social lives. Now I started keeping a list of every night shift employee who'd left in the past 2 years, cross-referencing their departure dates with my own memory of how their last shifts had gone. The pattern that emerged was chilling. At least 9 employees had called in sick immediately after their final shift and never returned to work. None of them had given 2 weeks' notice, or had farewell gatherings, or had explained their sudden departures. I contacted 3 of the former night shift workers through social media, sending casual messages asking how they were doing and where they'd ended up working. 2 of them never responded to my messages. The third, a nurse named Bethany who'd left 8 months ago, replied with a brief message saying she'd moved out of state for family reasons and didn't want to discuss her time at Mercy General. When I pressed for more information, asking if everything had been okay before she left, she blocked me. People don't block former co-workers for asking friendly questions unless they're hiding something or they're afraid of something. The real breakthrough came 2 weeks later when I worked a Saturday overnight shift. The hospital was even quieter than usual, with minimal staff and most of the administrative offices closed for the weekend. Around 2 a.m., I needed to access the medication dispensary on the fourth floor because we were running low on a particular pain medication. The elevator opened on the fourth floor, and I immediately noticed lights on in the administrative wing, which was supposed to be completely shut down overnight. I could hear voices coming from Dr. Whitmore's office, including her distinctive voice with its clipped, precise way of speaking. I moved quietly down the hallway, staying close to the wall and out of the direct line of sight from her office door, which was slightly ajar. What I heard made my blood run cold. Dr. Whitmore was on the phone with someone, discussing transfer payments and specimen quality. She mentioned specific dollar amounts, talking about how the latest acquisition had been particularly valuable because the candidate was young and healthy with an excellent medical history. She said the recovery time was minimal and the documentation had been handled through their usual offshore channels. I pulled out my phone and started recording the conversation, my hands shaking so badly I had to brace the phone against the wall to keep it steady. Dr. Whitmore continued talking about screening protocols and how they needed to be more selective about which night shift employees they recruited because the last candidate had required too much sedation and had nearly compromised the entire operation. She mentioned that they had 3 more scheduled for this month and that the surgical team would be arriving from their facility in Nevada to perform the procedures. The pieces started falling into place with horrifying clarity. The hospital wasn't just experiencing high turnover among night shift workers. They were actively recruiting specific employees, people who were healthy and fit, people who wouldn't be immediately missed because they worked overnight and had fewer connections with the larger hospital staff. They were doing something to these employees in the surgical wing, something that involved offshore documentation and payments and teams from out of state. The only thing that made sense was organ harvesting. I felt like I was going to throw up right there in the hallway. My co-workers, people I'd worked alongside for years, had been selected as unwilling donors for illegal organ transplants. That's why they disappeared suddenly, why they called in sick and never came back, why some of them responded to contact attempts with fear and silence. They'd been cut open and had pieces of themselves removed while unconscious, probably drugged during what they thought were routine employee health screenings or mandatory vaccinations. The hospital had access to everyone's medical records, knew exactly who had compatible blood types, knew who was healthy enough to survive the extraction. I backed away from the office as quietly as possible and took the stairs back down to my floor, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't go to hospital security because they were clearly part of this. I couldn't report it to my supervisor because Leslie had been working nights for over a decade, long enough to know what was happening, possibly long enough to be complicit in it. I needed outside help, law enforcement that wasn't connected to Mercy General's administration or personnel. The next morning, instead of going home, I drove straight to the county sheriff's office. I asked to speak with a detective about a criminal matter at Mercy General Hospital, and they connected me with Detective Raymond Foster, a 23-year veteran of the department who specialized in white-collar crime and institutional fraud. I sat in his office and played him the recording I'd made of Dr. Whitmore's phone conversation. I watched his expression change from skeptical interest to focused intensity as he listened to her discuss payments and specimens and surgical teams. Detective Foster asked me to start from the beginning and tell him everything I'd observed. I walked him through seeing David on the gurney, the pattern of employees disappearing after calling in sick, the orderlies who weren't in the personnel system, the blocked social media contacts, and the overheard conversation. He took notes in a small notebook, occasionally stopping me to ask for specific details like dates, times, and exact wording. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me this matched intelligence they'd received from the FBI about suspected organ trafficking operations in 3 states, but they hadn't been able to identify the specific hospitals involved. He explained that illegal organ harvesting was a billion-dollar international industry, and that U.S. hospitals with corrupt administrators could make enormous profits by supplying organs to wealthy patients willing to pay cash for transplants without waiting for legal donor lists. The operations were sophisticated, often involving medical professionals who'd lost their licenses in other countries, shell corporations for payment processing, and carefully selected donors who wouldn't be believed if they reported what happened. Most victims were told they'd experienced a medical emergency or a necessary surgery, and the trauma of the experience kept them from asking too many questions. Detective Foster made a phone call to a federal agent he'd worked with before, and within 3 hours, I was sitting in a conference room with 2 FBI agents who specialized in organized crime and human trafficking. Special Agent Diana Thornton was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd built her career prosecuting medical fraud cases. Her partner, Special Agent Kenneth Liu, had a background in forensic accounting and traced illegal payments across international borders. They listened to my recording, reviewed the documentation I'd compiled, and confirmed this was exactly the kind of operation they'd been tracking. Agent Thornton explained that I was in serious danger now. If Dr. Whitmore suspected I knew about the operation, I could become the next target. They'd already demonstrated they were willing to assault their own employees, and they had the medical infrastructure to make anyone disappear into their system. She recommended I stop working at the hospital immediately and consider protective custody while they built their case. But I told her that leaving suddenly would raise suspicions, and if I could keep working and gathering evidence, they'd have a stronger case for prosecution. We reached a compromise. I would continue working my normal shifts, but I'd wear a recording device provided by the FBI. I'd document anything suspicious and report daily to Agent Thornton. They'd have surveillance teams monitoring the hospital at night, watching for the out-of-state surgical teams that Dr. Whitmore had mentioned. If I felt threatened, or if they observed anything that suggested I was in immediate danger, they'd pull me out immediately. I signed paperwork acknowledging the risks and was fitted with a tiny recording device that looked like a regular name badge clip. The next 2 weeks were the most terrifying of my life. Every time I went to work, I wondered if this would be the night they grabbed me. Every routine procedure, every mandatory health screening, every moment I was alone in a hallway made my heart race. I documented everything with the recording device, capturing conversations between the night shift staff, recording the comings and goings of people in restricted areas, noting every inconsistency in the surgical schedule. The FBI was building a comprehensive case, but they needed direct evidence of the actual procedures being performed. That evidence came on a Monday night when Amit, the quiet recent graduate, didn't show up for his shift. Leslie made a casual comment about him probably calling in tomorrow to say he was sick, and the knowing way she said it confirmed my suspicion that she was involved. I immediately texted Agent Thornton with Amit's information, and she mobilized the surveillance team. Around 1 a.m., a white van with Nevada plates pulled up to the loading dock behind the hospital. 3 people in surgical scrubs got out and were met by Dr. Whitmore and 2 of the mysterious orderlies I'd seen before. The FBI surveillance team photographed everything. The Nevada plates came back registered to a shell corporation that owned several private surgical facilities in Las Vegas, facilities that operated outside normal medical regulations. The people in scrubs were identified as doctors who'd lost their licenses to practice in the United States but continued working in international medical tourism operations. This was the out-of-state surgical team Dr. Whitmore had mentioned, arriving to perform the illegal organ extractions. Agent Thornton gave me a choice. I could leave the hospital immediately, or I could try to get closer and capture evidence of what they were doing to Amit. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get out while I still could. But I thought about David and Bethany and all the others who'd been violated by these people, who'd had their bodies harvested without consent. I thought about Amit, who was probably unconscious somewhere in the surgical wing right now, about to lose a kidney or part of his liver to someone willing to pay cash for the privilege. I decided to stay. I told Leslie I needed to check on something in the pharmacy, which was on the same floor as the surgical wing. She nodded absently, not looking up from her computer. I took the stairs instead of the elevator to avoid security cameras and made my way to the surgical wing entrance. My badge still didn't open the door, but I'd learned that the emergency override code was posted in the staff break room for fire safety compliance. I punched in the code, and the door clicked open. The surgical wing was fully lit, and I could hear the sounds of medical equipment running. I moved through the corridors as quietly as possible, following the sounds to operating room 3. Through the window in the door, I saw Amit on the table, unconscious and intubated. Dr. Whitmore was there in full surgical gear, along with the 3 doctors from Nevada and 2 nurses I didn't recognize. They were in the process of making an incision along Amit's right flank, the standard approach for a nephrectomy, a kidney removal. I filmed everything through the window with my phone, my hands somehow steady despite the horror of what I was watching. They were actually doing it, cutting into a healthy young man without his consent to steal his organs for profit. The procedure was being performed with professional competence, which somehow made it worse. These were trained medical professionals who'd taken oaths to do no harm, now using their skills to mutilate their own colleagues for money. A hand grabbed my shoulder from behind and I nearly screamed. It was one of the orderlies, the broad-shouldered one I'd seen before. He demanded to know what I was doing in a restricted area and reached for my phone. I jerked away and ran, sprinting back toward the emergency exit. He chased after me, his footsteps heavy and fast behind me. I slammed through the exit door, triggering the alarm, and kept running down the stairwell. The sound of the alarm brought hospital security, which meant witnesses, which meant he couldn't grab me without being seen. I burst out of the ground floor exit into the employee parking lot, where the FBI surveillance team had been watching from an unmarked van. Agent Thornton jumped out and identified herself, badge held high, as the orderly emerged from the building behind me. He froze when he saw the FBI credentials, and then turned and ran back inside. Agent Thornton called for the rest of her team to move in immediately. They had probable cause now, direct observation of a medical procedure being performed without consent, and they were going to shut down the entire operation tonight. The next 4 hours were chaos. The FBI raided the surgical wing and found Amit still on the table, his surgery incomplete. They arrested Dr. Whitmore, the 3 Nevada doctors, the 2 nurses, and both orderlies. They seized computers, medical records, financial documents, and the organs that had been extracted and were being prepared for transport. Local police secured the building and evacuated all patients to other hospitals as a precaution. Ambulances lined up outside as they transferred everyone to safe facilities, treating Mercy General as a crime scene. I gave my statement to Agent Thornton at 3 a.m., sitting in the hospital cafeteria while FBI technicians photographed evidence all around us. She told me that Amit was stable and had been transported to a trauma center where legitimate surgeons would repair the damage. The incision they'd made was still superficial, and he would recover fully with no permanent organ loss. She said I'd saved his life by acting when I did, and that the evidence I'd gathered would put Dr. Whitmore and her associates in prison for decades. The investigation that followed uncovered an operation that had been running for 6 years. Dr. Whitmore had partnered with the Nevada Surgical Group to create a pipeline of unwilling organ donors, specifically targeting night shift hospital employees who could be isolated and controlled. They'd harvested kidneys, portions of liver, and in 2 cases, corneas, from at least 23 victims. The financial records showed they'd generated over $8 million in revenue from selling these organs to wealthy patients, mostly international buyers who paid cash through offshore accounts. The FBI located 12 of the victims still living in various states. Most of them had been told they'd experienced emergency medical situations requiring surgery, and they'd been given falsified medical records explaining their scars and recovery periods. Several had experienced chronic health problems from having organs removed, but they'd never connected their issues to their time at Mercy General. When investigators explained what had actually happened to them, the reactions ranged from disbelief to rage to psychological collapse. These people had been living with the trauma of unexplained surgery, and now they learned they'd been deliberately mutilated for profit. David, the co-worker I'd seen on the gurney, was located living 3 states away. He'd woken up after the procedure with a surgical scar and had been told he'd suffered a ruptured appendix that required emergency surgery. He'd felt confused because he didn't remember having any symptoms, but the doctors had showed him fabricated imaging studies and pathology reports. He'd left the hospital and moved away because something about the experience felt wrong, even though he couldn't articulate why. When the FBI showed him the evidence, he broke down crying, touching the scar on his abdomen while learning it was actually from a kidney removal. Bethany, the former nurse who'd blocked me on social media, had been one of the first victims. She'd been living with depression and anxiety since her surgery, convinced something terrible had happened but unable to prove it. The FBI located her in Arizona, and she agreed to testify about her experience. She'd been drugged during what was supposed to be a routine employee health screening, and had woken up 3 days later with a surgical scar and a story about emergency gallbladder surgery. She'd known it was a lie but had no evidence, and no one who would believe her concerns about her own employer. The trial took 8 months to prepare. Dr. Whitmore and her associates were charged with conspiracy, assault, human trafficking, practicing medicine without proper credentials, insurance fraud, and violations of federal organ transplant laws. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence including the recordings I'd made, the FBI surveillance footage, the financial records showing millions in illegal payments, and testimony from 14 victims who'd been harvested without consent. The defense tried to claim that all procedures had been medically necessary emergencies, but the forensic evidence proved that every single victim had been healthy before being targeted. I testified for 6 hours over 2 days, walking the jury through everything I'd observed and documented. The prosecutor asked me to explain the moment I first realized something was wrong, and I described seeing David's green shoes on that gurney, recognizing my co-worker being wheeled unconscious toward an unauthorized surgery. I saw several jury members react emotionally to that detail, understanding the betrayal of trust that occurred when a hospital turns its healing facilities into a hunting ground for its own employees. The most devastating testimony came from Amit, who'd been the last intended victim. He described waking up in the trauma center, confused and in pain, learning that his own supervisor had planned to steal his kidney. He'd trusted Dr. Whitmore, had seen her as a mentor who'd encouraged his nursing career. Now he had surgical scars and psychological trauma from realizing how close he'd come to permanent mutilation. He told the jury he still had nightmares about being on that operating table, about the violation of having his body cut open by people he'd worked alongside. The jury deliberated for 3 days and returned guilty verdicts on all counts for all defendants. Dr. Whitmore received a sentence of 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The 3 Nevada doctors each received 25 to 30 years. The nurses and orderlies who'd participated received sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years. The judge called it one of the most egregious violations of medical ethics he'd encountered in 4 decades on the bench, and he recommended that the medical board permanently revoke all licenses held by anyone involved. The civil lawsuits followed immediately. Every victim filed suit against Mercy General Hospital, its parent corporation, and its board of directors for failing to provide oversight and allowing a criminal operation to function within their facility for 6 years. The hospital's insurance carriers settled most of the cases quickly, paying out between $2 and $5 million per victim, depending on the severity of their injuries and ongoing medical needs. David received $3.2 million. Bethany received $4.1 million. Amit received $5.8 million because his case involved the most recent trauma, and he had the strongest evidence of institutional knowledge and conspiracy. Mercy General Hospital closed permanently 4 months after the arrests. The parent corporation declared bankruptcy rather than face the mounting legal liability, and the facility was seized by federal authorities as proceeds of crime. The building still stands empty, a monument to what happens when medical professionals betray the fundamental trust that should exist between healers and patients. Local news crews sometimes film outside, using it as a backdrop for stories about medical ethics and regulatory oversight. I couldn't continue working as a nurse after the trial. The trauma of what I'd discovered, combined with the months of wearing a wire and living in fear, had burned me out completely. I developed severe anxiety around hospitals and medical facilities, experiencing panic attacks whenever I smelled that particular combination of disinfectant and floor polish. Agent Thornton connected me with a therapist who specialized in whistleblower trauma, and I spent a year in intensive treatment learning how to process what I'd experienced. The FBI gave me a citation for civilian assistance in a federal investigation, and the victims' advocacy groups honored me with awards for exposing the operation. But the recognition didn't change the fact that I woke up at 3 a.m. most nights, my heart racing, convinced I heard footsteps in the hallway. trust had become almost impossible for me. If a hospital administrator could spend 6 years harvesting her own employees for profit, who else was hiding behind a professional mask? What other institutions were running criminal operations while presenting faces of respectability and care? 2 years after the trial, I ran into Leslie at a grocery store. She'd served 18 months before being released on parole for cooperating with investigators. She'd provided details about how Dr. Whitmore had recruited her, initially through small ethical compromises that escalated over time. She'd looked the other way when employees disappeared, and eventually she'd helped identify suitable candidates based on their medical records and personal circumstances. When she saw me in the grocery store, she tried to apologize, but I walked away. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive. Amit and I stayed in contact through email and occasional phone calls. He'd used his settlement money to go back to school and become a patient advocate, working to improve oversight of hospital operations and employee safety. He'd testified before the state legislature about the need for mandatory reporting systems and independent audits of surgical facilities. He told me that turning his trauma into advocacy was the only way he could make sense of what happened, the only way to ensure other people wouldn't experience what we'd survived. David had moved to a small town in Oregon and started a nonprofit organization that supported victims of medical crimes. He'd created a network where people who'd been harmed by healthcare providers could share resources and find legal assistance. He'd published a memoir about his experience that became a bestseller, raising awareness about the vulnerability of night shift workers and the importance of institutional accountability. He sent me a signed copy with an inscription, thanking me for seeing his green shoes and refusing to let it go. The financial settlement I received from the hospital's bankruptcy estate was modest compared to what the actual victims got, but it was enough to cover my therapy costs and allow me to take time off to recover. I eventually found work doing medical records consulting from home, using my nursing knowledge without having to set foot in another hospital. It's quiet work, solitary work, but it lets me contribute to healthcare without triggering the trauma that still lives in my nervous system. 3 years after everything ended, I received a letter from Dr. Whitmore's lawyer. She wanted to express remorse for what she'd done and hoped I might visit her in prison. The letter included justifications about financial pressures and rationalizations about how the donors had survived and how the recipients had lived because of the transplants. I read it once and then burned it in my kitchen sink. Her remorse was worthless. She'd spent 6 years destroying lives for profit, and no amount of prison yard reflection would change what she'd chosen to do. The hardest part of surviving this experience has been learning to live with the knowledge of how easily evil can hide behind competence and professionalism. Dr. Whitmore had been respected in her field, had published research papers, had mentored young medical professionals, and beneath that facade of excellence, she'd been running a butcher shop, harvesting human beings like they were inventory. That cognitive dissonance, understanding that monsters can have credentials and corner offices, has changed how I see every authority figure and every institution. But I've also learned that speaking up matters, even when you're terrified, even when the system seems too powerful to challenge. If I hadn't followed those green shoes, if I hadn't recorded that conversation, if I hadn't gone to Detective Foster with evidence, the operation would still be running. More people would have been drugged and cut open, more organs would have been stolen, more lives would have been destroyed. One person paying attention and refusing to look away can dismantle even sophisticated criminal enterprises. Agent Thornton retired from the FBI last year and sent me a card thanking me for my cooperation with the investigation. She wrote that the Mercy General case had led to reforms in how federal authorities monitor hospital operations and that 3 other similar operations had been discovered and shut down because of heightened awareness. She said my decision to keep working and gathering evidence despite the danger had created a template for how to investigate institutional medical crimes. She said I'd saved more lives than I'd ever know. I think about the night shift sometimes, about those quiet hours when the fluorescent lights hummed and the only sounds were monitors beeping and the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes on linoleum floors. There was something peaceful about working when the rest of the world slept, a sense of purpose in caring for vulnerable people during their darkest hours. Dr. Whitmore took that sense of purpose and perverted it into a hunting ground. She turned a healing space into a place of violation, and that betrayal still stings more than any of the fear or danger I experienced. The victims have formed a support group that meets monthly, sharing their experiences and supporting each other through the ongoing trauma of what was done to them. I attend sometimes when my anxiety allows it, sitting in a circle with people who understand what it means to have your body violated by the very professionals who were supposed to protect it. We don't always talk about the case. Sometimes we just exist together in a space where we don't have to explain or justify our fear or our anger or our struggle to trust medical providers. Last month, I drove past the empty Mercy General building. Someone had spray painted across the emergency room entrance. They cut out more than organs here. The graffiti had been there for months, according to local news reports, and the city had given up trying to remove it. It had become a memorial of sorts, a reminder that institutions can become predators and that vigilance is the price of safety. I took a photo of it and sent it to Amit. He replied, "Truth leaves scars too. At least these ones are visible. If you made it this far, hit like, you've earned it. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.